Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. When Peter wrote to me to ask if I would come and give this lecture, I was very happy to do so. Just to get an idea, did you have time to look at the text that was circulated beforehand? Yeah? Are there any burning questions that come out of that? Something you would like me to clarify? No? If anything comes, we can take it at the end anyway. Okay, I have entitled my presentation today, Insurance in War. What I really want to talk about is how this relationship between insurance and war alerts us of a relationship which I like to think of as a politics of uncertainty. When I think about uncertainty, I think of it politically, as a result of power relations, as an outcome of the relationality of power. I like to organize my talks around an intellectual challenge, a question in this case. And the question I would like to pose to you is, why is it that in the modern period there is a relationship between practices of sovereignty and sovereignty such as war and insurance? How is it that we get to understand this relationship between war and insurance? And I'm going to convince you that there is such a relationship. I'm going to give you some examples of that, some of which are in the book. You got the introduction and the second chapter as an illustration. But I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. Of course, I'm going to try to advance a thesis throughout the lecture. And the thesis is that there is a particular rationality of governance involved. And that rationality is what I call governing through risk. What enables us to understand why is it that there is relationship between insurance and war in the modern period is a rationality, a governmental rationality, and that is what I'm going to refer to as risk. I know this might be a slightly different angle from what you have been exposed to in the past, but I'm sure you're going to engage with it very well. My lecture then is going to be organized in three parts, well, two parts mainly. The first one, I'm going to present you with some cases to illustrate the relationship between insurance and war in the modern period. And the second part is a reflection on why is it that insurance has been adopted as an instrument of war. Now, because we are all non-English native speakers, do let me know if I start speaking too quick and you cannot follow. Just let me know. When I get excited with ideas, I tend to rush. So please raise your hand and say, slow down, please. And I'll finish with some concluding remarks. A couple of warnings here. My research around this topic has been incredibly and shamelessly Anglo-centric. And there's a reason why. When I was writing this book, when I was researching this topic, I was in the UK. And I was at the heart of the UK. And I could see this thing shouting at me whenever I walked around London. And I could see it in the buildings in Manchester. And I could see it whenever I walked between Whitehall and the Houses of Parliament. When you walk across the Strand, it's shouting at you. There's war and insurance telling you a story, even in the architecture. So I decided to research it, and I wrote a book about it. This doesn't mean that it's a universal Western phenomenon. I think there are elements that could be researched in the case of France, for instance. I'm doing something similar with Spain at the moment in a much earlier period. But I don't claim to make a general, I don't want to make a general claim here. But you'll understand why. So the cases I'm going to present you with, apart from the last one, are mainly circumscribed to the British political experience. So let me begin with the first one, which has to do with a phenomenon that I find incredibly problematic, and it's that of insuring enemy interests. So there are all kinds of examples to illustrate this, but there was in the Second Anglo-Dutch War in the early 18th century. It so happened that many of the Dutch Navy ships had been insured at Lloyd's of London. So whenever the Royal Navy sank a Dutch ship, it would be claimed for in London. So that created a lot of financial losses within the merchant population in London. Sounds like a contradiction. You're at war with a country. Whenever you inflict damage on that country comes and claims damages on you. Well, but it was legal to do so. And it remained legal all the way to 1794. and this is the period of the Napoleonic Wars. So in the period between the early 18th century all the way to the late 18th century, it was legal in Britain to insure against the risks of the enemy. The risks of the enemy are those that those are the interests of the enemy that I'm trying to destroy, that I'm trying to affect. If I want to win against the enemy, I have to destroy the interests of the enemy. That is the whole point. Now, what if those interests have been insured in my own soil? And that is the case here. Now, this is an interesting situation because we're talking of a general political economy in this time where the wealth of the nation has to do with the wealth of the trade of the nation. And it's a mercantilist understanding of the economy where what you really want to capture is bullion. You want to accumulate gold. You want to accumulate the riches. And if part of your riches are being lost to the enemy, this creates a bit of a paradox. Now, there was a bit of a debate in the Houses of Parliament in this period, several debates actually, and there were very strong arguments as to why they should allow these insurances to be possible. And there was a strong argument against them. When the Napoleonic Wars began, there was a rupture because it was seen that now that the country was at war with France, and particularly in the case of the Spanish ships, transport ships in this case, which were now part of the political organization with France, whenever those were sunk, then the claims would come to London. And that was starting to drain the national wealth. But this was not the only instance of the relationship between insurance and war in that period. What started to happen in that period as well was that insurers were basically merchants. Merchants who would want to invest in overseas trade mainly. They would gather in coffee shops, coffee houses, and they would gather to share information. That was a time where you wouldn't have the world of information we have these days. You actually had to go and be present in the space. And the coffee shop started to become this space. There was a famous coffee shop then, Edward Lloyd's coffee shop, which became the place to be if you wanted to trade with the outer world, mainly with the Americas and the Indies later on. What happened in this coffee shop was that it was a place where the captains of the ships would also gather, the owners of the ships, and those who would have some capital to invest in these ventures. And they created this idea of underwriting insurance, maritime insurance. The way they would do it is that they would put a poster on the wall. They would write the name of the ship, the captain, the destination, whatever relevant information was needed, how much money was being was needed for the venture, and how much insurance was required. Now think of this. If you are the owner of a ship with a valuable cargo going and coming from somewhere, you don't want to expose all the risk to your own self. You want to distribute this on different investors. That if the ship was sunk, you could distribute the losses amongst other people. Then you're willing to pay some money for unloading that risk. And the way they did it is that if I was somebody in that coffee shop and I saw that this ship was going to New York, and I said, well, it's 200,000 pounds what they need insurance for, I'll underwrite my name, I'll literally write my name under the ship, saying I'll take 50,000 pounds worth of risk. But I want, I don't know, a 10% interest on that money within a given period of time. And whenever the amount was completed, the ship was ready to sail. This is the traditional way of doing underwriting, maritime underwriting, in the early days of the Lloyd's Coffee House. This was not an institution yet. It was a coffee house, a meeting place, a marketplace, if you want. And slowly that started to evolve, and the people who would gather in that coffee shop started to realize that they were incredibly influential within the British establishment already. And they said, well, we need to start exercising some influence as a collective body. So they created the committee of the Lloyd's Coffee House. And it was a committee of a coffee house. It was still not a formal institution. Yet they had their organization, and they would communicate continuously with the Board of Admiralty. The Board of Admiralty was basically the entity that run the Admiralty. And as you know, Britain, a trading maritime nation, it relied on its navy in order to be able to do this. And it came to a situation where there is correspondence, stable correspondence between the Lloyd's coffee house, the committee at Lloyd's, and the Board of Admiralty from between 1775 and 1815. These are the documents that I used for my book. And that correspondence is very interesting because we get to the point of the Committee of Lloyd's writing letters like this one, although this letter is several pages long, in which they say 40 of our merchants in the Adriatic region, in the coast of what today is Croatia, are telling us that there is a heightened presence of pirates in that region. And therefore, we need to do something about it. Now, the Royal Navy is in the Mediterranean, in the Malta area, but they're really not patrolling the Adriatic. So we, as a Committee of Lloyd's, write to the Board of Admiralty saying, you need to pay attention to this, and this is how. You need to send X amount of ships with certain kind of guns. You need to operate them in a specific way. They even mention a tactic, and we would like this to happen very soon. Now, what you find is that on the back of this document, in the corner, this letter was addressed to the Board of Admiralty. So the clerk, the secretary, if you wish, of that board was taking notes as to what the board had decided. And what says here in the corner is, please forward these instructions to Lord Nelson, stationed in Malta, with a petition to pay the utmost serious attention to the matter. Now, it goes to some detail. I researched what happened thereafter, and I actually saw that that was actually executed. It was an order that was carried on. And this is just an illustration of the influence then that we have of a group of merchants, in this case insurance underwriters, over the Board of Admiralty, on which the security of overseas trade for the British Empire, the British Empire relied on. So this is just one illustration of how this relationship between insurance and war happens. There's one more thing I need to say is that if you're a merchant and you are underwriting this kind of business, you start getting premiums paid for the policies that you write. So say that I underwrote £10,000 for this trip to New York, I'm going to get some money for that. Now that's money that I need to be able to use in case there is a claim, in case that ship sinks or it's attacked by pirates or whatever. I should be able to use all that money that I collected to pay damages, to settle a claim. But it's highly unlikely that that claim will happen because I have invested in many policies. I have a lot of cash that I need to do something with. I need to invest it in a conservative way. I don't want to risk too much of it. I need to be able to take it back if I need it. And yet I want to make an interest in that. And in those times, as in today's times, it's very difficult to find a solid investment vehicle. And nowadays you can invest in stock, in government bonds, in different kinds of real estate. What the insurers at Lloyd's started to do was that they started buying navy bonds. So Britain was always at war. Britain always had this requirement to invest more and more money in its ships and in its maritime ventures. There was never enough cash. So they would sell bonds, navy bonds. They will say you can redeem this bond in 5 years' time at a 6% interest. Well, that's a stable source of place to invest. And the return is fairly decent. So they would buy those bonds. Now imagine a situation where all these merchants are buying bonds, navy bonds, and navy bonds, and navy bonds. Well, if the navy fails, they're in trouble, right? There would be no money to pay this situation back. If the nation goes bankrupt, or if it's defeated in war, it's the merchants mainly who take the burden. Now, this gave rise to phrases in these kinds of letters that I looked at, in which the merchants refer to Britain as this commercial kingdom. They use explicitly that phrase, and that I find fascinating, because you can really understand what the British establishment is about in that period by analyzing this kind of relationships. Now, as I was telling you, by 1794, because of this serious investment the merchants had made in the success of the country, they simply couldn't tolerate any longer this insurance on enemy risks, and that came to an end. I can tell you more about that, but I'm going to move on. Second case I want to relate to you, still in relation to Britain, has to do with the period between 1890 and 1920. And it's a period where we start having a situation in which, well, it's the period of the First World War, of course, and before that. Britain was incredibly exposed to an international war because, being an island state, it relied on its supplies through on maritime trade. And of course, if Britain went to war, one of the first things to be affected would be the sea lanes, the maritime connections. And if you were the owners of ships, you would know that insurance, maritime insurance you would have taken on those ships would have a clause that would cancel the policy in case of war. Of course, if I am the insurer and I'm insuring somebody to somebody's ship, I'm insuring it under normal conditions. And if these conditions geopolitically change drastically, I'm not willing to accept that heightened risk. I would have to sell you a new policy to do that. It was expected that if Britain went to war, most of those policies not only would be rendered void, but nobody would be willing to insure those ships because there was literally a sitting duck. They could be sank. And that's what happened in the First World War with the U-boat campaign and so on. So what to do? And this is very interesting because what happened was that then the government became the reinsurer of first resort. So insurance works in this way. I need insurance for my ship. I go to an insurance company or a person who is willing to insure me. That person insures me, but then that person or company wants to be insured as well. So you go and buy reinsurance. And the reinsurance is insurance over insurance policies. So it's a second layer, if you wish. Normally, the idea was that you spread risks in that way, so losses will never be concentrated. But there would be no reinsurance in case of war. So it's a state which has to become the reinsurer of first resort. And they created this thing they call the War Risk Insurance Scheme that started shortly before the war. Britain did not enter the First World War until that scheme was approved. The same day it was approved, Britain entered the war. That's very telling. Why would it do so? And it would do so in order to keep its maritime lanes open and trade and supplies coming into the country to keep the empire afloat. And that's the phrase that they used. Now, it became an incredibly good source of profit for the government to do so. They accumulated a lot of money, and the claims they had to settle were very few. So it became good business. That's a characteristic you should never forget in relation to this. I'm going to come back to it at the back. These insurance schemes are profitable. They need to be profitable, and everybody profits from them within these liberal regimes. Now, the third case I wanted to mention now is zooming quickly into the Second World War, and it's known as the 1939 British War Risks Insurance Act. Very much modeled under the previous scheme of the First World War, but the difference here is that once the war ended, it stayed in place. So the government in this case was not the reinsurer of first resort, but the reinsurer of last resort. So what they added was a new layer to the risk distribution scheme. So I would get, the owner of the ship or the owner of the cargo would go to the insurer would go to the reinsurer. The reinsurer would only reinsure if it had a guarantee that the British government would come to its aid in case things went wrong. And again, the scheme worked. It became very profitable. And it's the same scheme that operates for things such as terrorism attacks and earthquakes and catastrophic risk, with some variations. Since 1953, it became an act of parliament, and thereon has given it has provided the base for much legislation after that. But that's a very long topic I'm not going to engage with now. And the last example I'm going to give you now has to do with the post-Cold War environment, post-1990. It's not surprising, by the way, that if you go and look at the discourses around NATO as to what NATO should be like after the Cold War, you find lots of material that actually shows that NATO is becoming a risk manager, a global risk manager. And you find a change in discourse from a traditional threat-based approach to security to more of a risk-based approach to security. And that's something that there's a long literature to read if you're interested in. I'll be happy, or Peter will be very happy to refer you to it. But it becomes very interesting because we start seeing other kinds of threats, if you wish, in this world, which can be interpreted as risks and not necessarily as threats. If you want to understand something as a threat, you need to neutralize it, perhaps destroy it, and make sure that it doesn't emerge again. If you problematize, which is this Foucauldian approach, if you problematize a situation rather than as a threat but as a risk, then you have certain mechanisms to manage it. You don't need to destroy it necessarily. You can manage it, and then by managing it, you can deactivate it if you wish. You can transform it into your own benefit. You can profit greatly from it. And what we start finding from the 1990s onwards is that the good old Lloyd's of London, which by then, of course, had become an institution, but it's an institution which is not an insurance company, it's a marketplace. It's a marketplace where members can come together and trade in the trading floor and the insurance floor. It's for members only, but it's a marketplace, and it has its organization. So we have Lloyd's of London, which is a marketplace, and we have NATO, which is a military alliance. And we have NATO and Lloyd's as bedfellows, right? They come together. And it's rather bizarre, because we're not talking of states coming together. We have a military alliance on the one hand, and a marketplace. And they create an alliance, which actually didn't make much noise, and very few people got to know about that alliance. You can trace that in newspaper articles, for example. There are hints here and there that it came into being. No official documents, though, but there are practices through which you can understand how this worked. And it has been working on three fronts. One, maritime piracy. The second one, climate change. And the third one, cybercrime. So those are three issues in the agenda of Lloyd's, which coincide with the agenda of NATO. So this is another chapter of a relationship between insurance and war in the post-Cold War period, which is definitely worth examining a bit more. Now, these are the four cases I wanted to present to you in order to demonstrate to you that there is such thing as a relationship between insurance and war in the modern period. And I've been very broad and very quick. And now I'm going to jump into the analysis. Okay, so what sense does this make? I want to reflect on these cases and try to take a bit more of an abstract perspective here. Why is it that in the modern period there is a relationship between practices of sovereignty such as war and insurance? So I tend to use this slide to reflect about how is it that what we call the uncertain gets transformed into something we call risk. There's a process in between that we transform uncertainty into risk. And the bottom line is that actually you're transforming something that is an idea and you're actually selling it. Okay, so you're selling thin air. If you go back to the 13th century in the medieval Renaissance, what you find there is a big debate on the problem of usury in relation to these kind of practices. And the church would say you cannot charge for risk because that constitutes usury. You're making money out of money. There's a long debate around that. But there was a way to settle it, and I'm not going to get into those details now. When we get to the modern period, this is common practice. You transform uncertainty into risk. Once it's known as presented as risk, you can do stuff with it. I theorized on that in the first book by referring to it as oh dear, I forgot the term now. But anyway, you transform that uncertainty into risk and you sell it. To get to understand this, I'm going to go step by step. We're going to talk something about what how do we come to understand uncertainty, and what is it that we come to understand by risk for making insurance possible? Yeah, the term is you make uncertainty fungible. Fungibility is something that makes it amenable to be traded and exchanged. And this is something that has happened in the Western political and economic experience, which is fascinating. This didn't happen in other parts of the world, which is one of the claims for modernity within what is known as the Probabilistic Revolution. Now, what is the uncertain? And the uncertain can be understood in all kinds of ways. I'm going to give you my perspective, of course, which is deeply influenced by the work of Michel Foucault and some of his followers, and some other thinkers, Deleuze included. And I argue that uncertainty can only be understood from a position of presumed certainty. Think of yourselves, well, I'm going to use myself as a case. I'm a professor. I have some financial stability. I own a house. I have a family. I feel rather certain, right? Or I perceive myself as having some level of certainty. Now, I also think about the uncertainties in relation to my position. There could be a global financial crisis. It could be that that global financial crisis would create all kinds of tax problems for the Dutch government, which pays for the university that employs me, and then my salary might be at risk. There is an uncertainty relation there. I could find uncertainties in relation to health. It could be a pandemic, right? I could fall sick. I could have an accident. All those are uncertainties that I think of in relation to my present condition, which I consider to be relatively certain. Now, that certainty could always be problematized in different ways. Some other person can say, well, it's not so certain because of this or of that, but I consider it from my own perspective to be certain. You can take the case of France, its position in the world at the moment, its geopolitical standing, its situation within the European Union, and however you define that certainty to be, you would think the different uncertainties from it. This is to say that uncertainty is a derivative from perceptions of certainty. Now, there's an argument to be made in relation to that, which has to do with how we understand the certain to be. What makes us consider something to be certain or not? And you would realize that there's a lot of proximity with debates on truth. Truth with capital T as dogma, but truths with lowercase t as perceptions of truth. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm happy to engage with it in the questions if you want more. I assume you've dealt with some of that in the course as well. So this is the second point, that certainties are construed through forms of truth. What might be true for me now might not have been true for me a decade ago. And therefore, my certainty today is different from that which I had in the past, and it's certainly going to be different. Certainly. It's going to be different from my certainties in the future. It has to do with my perception of my order of the real, what I consider to be out there. And the third point that I have in relation to the understanding of uncertainty is when the knowledge that informs a form of truth changes, so does the presumed certainty. If I know, or I claim to know, that the economy of the world works around the success of a neoliberal project, and I consider that to be true, if the knowledge that informs that truth for me changes, I might revalue my position. And I might say, actually, the truth is not really, the truth that supports my certainty is not really the neoliberal project that should be effective and so on and so forth, but there would be something else. I might change my whole equation. This is to say that as students or scholars or analysts, we should always be in the driving seat here. This analysis of certainty and truth, it's always an analytical practice. There's no science to it. We have to understand the knowledge that we have available in order to be able to make our own assessment as to what we consider to be true or not, and how does that constitute a perception of certainty, from which we would understand the different uncertainties. Does this make any sense to you so far? Not at all, you say, right? Why? What are you confused on?
I didn't get it.
Sorry?
You talked too fast, didn't get it.
I'm going too fast, you didn't get it. Yeah. Let me go back. So what I'm trying to say is that Sorry, I'm getting out of the area. If I want to understand what makes something certain, I need to understand what is the knowledge that I am taking into account to agree that that is certain or not. That puts us to the point of what are the truths that have to be in place for me to understand or to accept something as certain. Once I consider something to be certain, and it's my own perception, then I can think about the uncertainties to it. This is to say that there's no such thing as certainty or uncertainty in the abstract or in the general. It always relates to a perception, and that puts us in the center of the analysis. I'm going to move on, and maybe I come back to it in case you need more examples for that. Now, there's something quite particular. Remember, I'm trying to get you from uncertainty to risk. And there's something I need to say in the middle for us then to understand what happens with risk. And that something is that we really have a problem at the core of this. And you can even go as far as saying that it is a truly modern problem, a problem of modernity. And it's a problem that has to do with measurements, with finding a way to assess something that has not taken place, and this is the likelihood of an event taking place with some level of certainty. I'm going to rewind a little bit here to put you in a situation before the 17th century when we didn't have probabilities as the mathematics through which we calculate the likelihood of an event taking place. Before that, you could still insure, right? You could insure your ship at Lloyd's, and the insurer at Lloyd's would say, well, here in the poster it says that the ship is this ship. Yeah, I know that ship. I can go and inspect it as well. I want to know if it's solid or not. I know the captain. That captain has a great record of looking after the ships and the cargo, and it's a very able seaman. And I also know the owner of the cargo and the owner of the ship, and they're reliable merchants. And therefore, and I also know that the route might have some risks, but okay, they can be handled. I'm going to insure. I'm only basing my assessment on the information that I have at my disposal and my experience as a merchant underwriter. And sometimes gut feeling, right? But we're not talking about anything scientific here. We're not talking about anything quantifiable yet. Now, in the period between the mid-1650s and the 1750s, we have what is known in the literature as the Probabilistic Revolution. And this is the time, slightly earlier than that actually, the time of Fermat, Pascal, pardon my French, I have no pronunciation in French, Huygens, Bernoulli, De Moivre, and so on. And these people, what they were doing, not in a single place in Europe, but in different parts of Europe, mainly Western Europe, they were trying to figure out mathematically how can you calculate probabilities of something taking place. And this is what they call the Probabilistic Revolution, which has to do with a way of calculating the likelihood of an event taking place. Now, what needs to be in place for us to think and plan in terms of events? We do that every day these days, but it wasn't so common there then yet. What do you think needs to be in place for that to be possible? Why do we need a metric to calculate probabilities? What needs to be possible in place for that? What do you think? Think of the previous period when, if you were a very good Christian, you might not have that problem. If you're a very good Christian, you would trust in God, especially if you had deep faith. God would provide, and if something happened, it was God's will, right? And if you're a really, really good Christian, you simply wouldn't go and look for this kind of forms of anticipating the future for two reasons. One is that if you anticipated the future, you spoke about anticipating the future, and you didn't have the support of the church, what would that be called? Heresy. Yes, absolutely, and you would be considered a witch. How dare you guess the future? The future belongs to God. So only those who are sanctioned by the church, authorized by the church, which are allowed to anticipate the future, but it's actually part of the whole Christian organization. And those are the prophets, right? So you could only talk about the future if you are a prophet. So we have a situation of prophecy. That's the only way you could think about the future. And you could think about events. And the major event in Christianity was what? The coming back. Yes. It's, we're talking of a situation in which we prepare for the coming back of God, right? So we must behave in a particular way. We have a whole moral economy built around that in order to be able to save our souls. It's an economy of salvation, so to speak. But in this period, in the 17th and 16th century, we start having a situation where you're moving away from that. So now you have a problem. You cannot blame it on God, right? You cannot leave that to God. You must still remain faithful and Christian, and yet you start thinking about the future. You start thinking about the future in terms of events. And that is what Reinhard Koselleck refers to as a shift from prophecy to prognosis. So we start working on prognosticating our time. So we start thinking towards the future. We become future-oriented. Rather than just living in the present, we start always planning for the future. And you buy insurance in order to do that. But if you really want to do it in a systematic way, now you have a big challenge, which is how are you going to measure the likelihood of that future you have thought of from taking place. And that future that you're thinking of is thought of in terms of events. So I'm going to illustrate this. If I want to insure my ship, I'm the owner of a ship with a cargo, I cannot just insure it for anything for any period of time. Nobody's going to insure me for that. I need to say, well, my trip is going to New York, it's going to bring a cargo of cloth, and it's going to take place within this period of time more or less, and this is the ship. So I'm circumscribing what that event is through its characteristics. In simple terms, what I'm doing is that I'm defining the interest I am insuring against. So technically speaking, you can only insure against an interest. And this is the big debate of the period, was that insurance was equated with gambling. I would say, I'm going to bet on the life of the Pope, on the death of the Pope. I'm going to insure against the Pope dying in the next year, for example, or on the king or the queen dying in the next year. But if and that was considered to be a form of gambling, because then say that you bet it not on the king or the Pope, but on somebody in your neighborhood, and you put some money on it, well, you might be creating a market for that person to die, for example. And it created all kinds of gambles. I mentioned some of those in this book and in the previous book. The way to cancel that from happening was an act of parliament in Britain which spoke about the insurable interest. You could only insure if you could demonstrate you had an insurable interest. In these days, in our times, if you crash your car, if you have a fire in your house, or you have an accident or something, and then you say, it's all fine, nothing to worry about, I have an insurance policy that covers me for that. You then go to the insurer would look at the policy, would look at the event that actually took place, and would say, the event you insured for is not quite what you're claiming for. Or they would say, actually, yes, it does match. If it matches, they'll honor the claim. If they argue that the event is not the same that you had insured for, they won't pay for it, and then you're in trouble. So that is always the case with with insurance and the insurable interest. All of this comes from this period of the Probabilistic Revolution. And that has been the single most important change in the modern period for insurance. Now, this is what I was referring to here in the middle. Something happens to uncertainty to turn it into risk. And how is it that we come to think risk of in our contemporary times? And this is typical risk rate. Are you familiar with it? Have you seen it before? So it's basically plotting the magnitude of an event, or the impact, if you wish, of an event taking place, saying an earthquake. If an earthquake takes place in Paris, you can imagine the impact, well, could be very big. But if it's, let's say, a medium-sized earthquake in Paris, the impact can be quite high. And the damages that would result from that could be quite important. Now, the other question is the probability, the likelihood of that happening. If the likelihood is very low or if it's very high, will help us decide what level of risk is it. So we know, for instance, that if an earthquake takes place in Paris, the impact is going to be quite high, I would say between medium and very high. But how do we know the probability of that taking place? You go and speak with geologists. Geologists would say, well, we cannot rule it out. There is a risk of that happening, but we don't really know. If it has happened in the past, it's likely that it will happen again in the next million years. But that's quite a long period of time. So the probabilities are quite unknown. We tend to think of that situation as very low. So then you go and plot your case around here. If it falls within the blue area, that's the area that we call manageable risks. If it falls between in the yellow area, those are negligible risks, risk for which we really don't need to do much about. I don't know, the risk of people falling in the metro of Paris. Well, what are the great impacts of that? What can you do to manage it? It's not a very big risk that you need to consider in this kind of situations. But there are those risks which are considered to be of high probability and of very high impact. And those are risks for which we don't really know how to manage them. And this is always a matter of opinion as well. But one of the catastrophic scenarios in security studies is the idea of a dirty bomb in the center of London, New York, or Paris. You know what a dirty bomb is? So it's basically a portable nuclear device that you carry in a suitcase, right? It's a small nuclear device, but can create tremendous damage in a limited area. But if that area is the center of one of these big cities, you can have lasting damage of great proportions. Some analysts say that the probability of that taking place might be quite high, and the impact would be disastrous, and therefore we need to find the ways on how to manage it. Risk management is about keeping everything within the blue area. And if something belongs to the red area, the idea is to push the limit of the blue area in order to cover that. We've seen lots of cases on that in relation to insurance against earthquakes and environmental things such as hurricanes in the US. And nowadays we have one for pandemics, and we have one for extended vitality, so people are living longer. That's costing a lot of money to the insurance industry. It might not be payable, and they're always finding ways to do that. I'm not going to get into those details, though. And then we end up having this situation that we think of uncertainties, we do something to them, we turn them into risks, and we do that because we want to govern them. We want to govern the possible outcomes, and we want to control the likelihood of them taking place. Now, the three thoughts I want to leave you with in relation to all this. What I have been presenting you with here really is an understanding of risk, which is taken to be a rationality for governance. I could wear my risk hat and see the world as risk. Absolutely everything would be termed in terms of risk. Now, it could be argued that liberal governance is about that. Is about, especially from the 1970s onwards, it's about trying to understand reality in terms of risks. Why? Because then I can go and manage them. I can go and plot that and design mechanisms to manage that situation. I don't want just to be waiting for it to happen. I want to be able to anticipate it, and I have mechanisms for that. So one is that governing through risk is a rationality of governance, but it's a practice of prognosis, of anticipating the future, which requires three things. The first one is the formulation of events. But I want to formulate an event in terms of a risk. I don't want to know if Veronica is going to die. That I know for certain. I just don't know when. So I can say, if Veronica is, I don't know, the breadwinner in the house, and she has newborn children, and I want to make sure that those children will be cared for financially until they're 18, I might be able to get a life policy, a life insurance policy over the life of Veronica for 18 years. And what I'm really protecting there is not that she doesn't die, because that can happen. What I want to protect is the income that those children would require in order to be able to be financially independent if she was to die, or if she was to fall sick. So I'm determining an event, and it's the health of Veronica to work for the next 18 years. And if that doesn't materialize, then I would have, that would be the event against which I would be insuring. I want to be able to ensure that if there is a terrorist attack in Paris, there will be sufficient financial means to reconstruct the city of Paris. In order to do that, I need to not just say that in the abstract. I need to circumscribe what the city of Paris is. I need to circumscribe it in time, and I need to set some top values as well. Then I can go and plan, and I have an event against which I'm going to insure, and that is prognosis. So it's a practice of prognosis that needs to be in place there. Second point is planning strategies to manage them. Once I think of the order in terms of events, then I can start planning. And we're all about planning and planning and planning, to the point that one of the most profitable but also most influential sciences of our time is logistics. It's about planning. It's about ensuring that the right thing is at the right time at the right place. That's about planning. And the third point here is profiting from the process. This form of prognostic thinking and this way of ensuring governing through risk is profitable and is designed to be profitable. It's not the only way of governing, but this helps us understand a lot what liberalism is about. Now, the second point to conclude with is that perceptions of certainty are continuously challenged, so are the correlated formulations of uncertainty. If we get to know that climate change, which we all believe is a fact, if we looked at it historically, the climate is always changing. But in which direction is what we don't know. Say that tomorrow we have a knowledge base that shows us that actually the change in the climate is such that we need to worry much more about what we're doing, or we don't have to worry at all. That would change the way we relate to climate and how we plan around it, the kind of events we formulate. And the third point is that governance can be understood as the art of managing uncertainty. And here we're talking about liberal governance. Governance is about trying to decide what is it that is considered to be certain and uncertain on a continuous basis. That is my formulation about governance, particularly in that book. And with those three thoughts, I would like to leave it. And you're welcome to distribute the slides if you wish, so they can think them through. So thank you very much.